scholarship had not been renewed. So I went to the office to ask why, and they told me, well, no one sent us the financial statement, and we allocated all the scholarship money and it's all gone, so I'm afraid that you don't have a scholarship here anymore. That was the style of the place. They simply didn't care. They didn't give a shit about their students. There was no counseling, no mentoring, nothing. Chris left Reed before the final set of exams, leaving him with a row of FS on his transcript. In the first semester, he had earned as. He went back to Bozeman and worked in construction and as a Forest Services firefighter for a year and a half. Then he enrolled at Montana State University. I was taking math and philosophy classes, he recalled. And then in the winter quarter, I was living 13 miles out of town, out on Beach Hill Road, and the transmission fell out of my car. My brothers had used it when I was gone that summer. They were working for the railroad and had driven it on the railroad tracks. I didn't have the money to repair it. So I went to my advisor and the dean in sequence and said, I have a problem. The transmission fell out of my car, and you have me in a 7:30 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. class. If you could please just transfer me to the afternoon sections of these classes, I would appreciate it because of this car problem. There was a neighbor who was a rancher who was going to take me in at 11 o'clock. My advisor was this cowboy-looking guy with a handlebar mustache, dressed in a tweed jacket. He said, well, son, after looking at your transcript at Reed College, I see that you have yet to learn that everyone has to make sacrifices to get an education. Request denied. So then I went to the dean. Same treatment. His voice grew tight. He was describing things that had happened more than 30 years ago, but the memory still made him angry. At that point I realized, here I was, knocking myself out to make the money to make my way back to school, and it's the middle of the Montana winter. I am willing to hitchhike into town every day, do whatever I had to do, just to get into school and back, and they are unwilling to do anything for me. So bananas. And that was the point I decided I could do without the higher education system. Even if I couldn't do without it, it was sufficiently repugnant to me that I wouldn't do it anymore. So I dropped out of college, simple as that. Chris Langan's experiences at Reed and Montana State represented a turning point in his life. As a child, he had dreamt of becoming an academic. He should have gotten a PhD. Universities are institutions structured, in large part, for people with his kind of deep intellectual interests and curiosity. Once he got into the university environment, I thought he would prosper, I really did, his brother Mark says. I thought he would somehow find a niche. It made absolutely no sense to me when he left that. Without a degree, Langan floundered. He worked in construction. One frigid winter he worked on a clam boat on Long Island. He took factory jobs and minor civil service positions and eventually became a bouncer in a bar on Long Island, which was his principal occupation for much of his adult years. Through it all, he continued to read deeply in philosophy, mathematics, and physics as he worked on a sprawling treatise he calls the CTMU, the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe. But without academic credentials, he despairs of ever getting published in a scholarly journal. I am a guy who has a year and a half of college, he says, with a shrug. And at some point this will come to the attention of the editor, as he is going to take the paper and send it off to the referees, and these referees are going to try and look me up, and they are not going to find me. And they are going to say, this guy has a year and a half of college. How can he know what he's talking about? Would take a job at Harvard University were it offered to him. Well, that's a difficult question, he replied. Obviously, as a full professor at Harvard I would count. My ideas would have weight and I could use my position, my affiliation at Harvard, to promote my ideas. An institution like that is a great source of intellectual energy, and if I were at a place like that, I could absorb the vibration in the air. It was suddenly clear how lonely his life has been. Here he was, a man with an insatiable appetite for learning, forced for most of his adult life to live in intellectual isolation. I even noticed that kind of intellectual energy in the year and a half I was in college, he said, almost wistfully. Ideas are in the air constantly. It's such a stimulating place to be. On the other hand, he went on, Harvard is basically a glorified corporation, operating with a profit incentive. That's what makes it tick. It has an endowment in the billions of dollars. The people running it are not necessarily searching for truth and knowledge. They want to be big shots, and when you accept a paycheck from these people, it is going to come down to what you want to do and what you feel is right versus what the man says you can do to receive another paycheck. When you're there, they got a thumb right on you. They are out to make sure you don't step out of line. 2. What does the story of Chris Langan tell us? His explanations, as heartbreaking as they are also a little strange. His mother forgets to sign his financial aid form and, just like that, no scholarship. He tries to move from a morning to an afternoon class, something students do every day, and gets stopped cold. And why were Langan's teachers at Reed and Montana State so indifferent to his plight? Teachers typically delight in minds as brilliant as his. Langan talks about dealing with Reed and Montana State as if they were some kind of vast and unyielding government bureaucracy. But colleges, particularly small liberal arts colleges like Reed, tend not to be rigid bureaucracies. Making allowances in the name of helping someone stay in school is what professors do all the time. Even in his discussion of Harvard, it's as if Langan has no conception of the culture and particulars of the institution he's talking about. When you accept a paycheck from these people, it is going to come down to what you want to do and what you feel is right versus what the man says you can do to receive another paycheck. What? One of the main reasons college professors accept a lower paycheck than they could get in private industry is that university life gives them the freedom to do what they want to do and what they feel is right. Langan has Harvard backwards. When Langan told me his life story, I couldn't help thinking of the life of Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who famously headed the American effort to develop the nuclear bomb during World War II. Oppenheimer, by all accounts, was a child with a mind very much like Chris Langan's. His parents considered him a genius. One of his teachers recalled that he received every new idea as perfectly beautiful. He was doing lab experiments by the 3rd grade and studying physics and chemistry by the 5th grade. When he was 9, he once told one of his cousins, "Ask me a question in Latin and I will answer you in Greek." Oppenheimer went to Harvard and then on to Cambridge University to pursue a doctorate in physics. There, Oppenheimer, who struggled with depression his entire life, grew despondent. His gift was for theoretical physics, and his tutor, a man named Patrick Blackett, was forcing him to attend to the minutiae of experimental physics, which he hated. He grew more and more emotionally unstable, and then, in an act so strange that to this day no one has properly made sense of it, Oppenheimer took some chemicals from the laboratory. Blackett, luckily, found out that something was amiss. The university was informed. Oppenheimer was called on the carpet. And what happened next is every bit as unbelievable as the crime itself. Here is how the incident is described in American Prometheus, Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin's biography of Oppenheimer. After protracted negotiations, it was agreed that Robert would be put on probation and have regular sessions with a prominent Harley Street psychiatrist in London. On probation? Here we have 2 very brilliant young students, each of whom runs into a problem that imperils his college career. Langan's mother has missed a deadline for his financial aid. Oppenheimer has tried to poison his tutor. To continue on, they are required to plead their cases to authority. And what happens? Langan gets his scholarship taken away, and Oppenheimer gets sent to a psychiatrist. Oppenheimer and Langan might both be geniuses, but in other ways, they could not be more different. The story of Oppenheimer's appointment to be scientific director of the Manhattan Project 20 years later is perhaps an even better example of this difference. The general in charge of the Manhattan Project was Leslie Groves, and he scoured the country, trying to find the right person to lead the atomic bomb effort. Oppenheimer, by rights, was a long shot. He was just 38, and junior to many of the people whom he would have to manage. He was a theorist, and this was a job that called for experimenters and engineers. His political affiliations were dodgy, he had all kinds of friends who were communists. Perhaps more striking, he had never had any administrative experience. He was a very impractical fellow, one of Oppenheimer's friends later said. He walked about with scuffed shoes and a funny hat, and, more important, he didn't know anything about equipment. As one Berkeley scientist put it, more succinctly, he couldn't run a hamburger stand. Oh, and by the way, in graduate school he tried to kill his tutor. This was the resume of the man who was trying out for what might be said to be, without exaggeration, one of the most important jobs of the 20th century. And what happened? The same thing that happened 20 years earlier at Cambridge. He got the rest of the world to see things his way. Here are Bird and Sherwin again. Oppenheimer understood that Groves guarded the entrance to the Manhattan Project, and he therefore turned on all his charm and brilliance. It was an irresistible performance. Groves was smitten. He's a genius, Groves later told a reporter. A real genius. Groves was an engineer by training with a graduate degree from MIT, and Oppenheimer's great insight was to appeal to that side of Groves. Bird and Sherwin go on. Oppenheimer was the first scientist Groves had met on his tour who grasped that building an atomic bomb required finding practical solutions to a variety of cross-disciplinary problems. Found himself nodding in agreement when Oppenheimer pitched the notion of a central laboratory devoted to this purpose, where, as he later testified, we could begin to come to grips with chemical, metallurgical, engineering and ordnance problems that had so far received no consideration. Would Oppenheimer have lost his scholarship at Reed? Would he have been unable to convince his professors to move his classes to the afternoon? Of course not. And that's not because he was smarter than Chris Langan. It's because he possessed the kind of savvy that allowed him to get what he wanted from the world. They required that everyone take introductory calculus, Langan said of his brief stay at Montana State. And I happened to get a guy who taught it in a very dry, very trivial way. I didn't understand why he was teaching it this way. So I asked him questions. I actually had to chase him down to his office. I asked him, why are you teaching this way? Why do you consider this practice to be relevant to calculus? And this guy, this tall, lanky guy, always had sweat stains under his arms. He turned and looked at me and said, you know, there is something you should probably get straight. Some people just don't have the intellectual firepower to be mathematicians. There they are, the professor and the prodigy, and what the prodigy clearly wants is to be engaged, at long last, with a mind that loves mathematics as much as he does. But he fails. In fact, and this is the most heartbreaking part of all, he manages to have an entire conversation with his calculus professor without ever communicating the one fact most likely to appeal to a calculus professor. The professor never realizes that Chris Langan is good at calculus. 3. The particular skill that allows you to talk your way out of a murder rap, or convince your professor to move you from the morning to the afternoon section, is what the psychologist Robert Sternberg calls practical intelligence. To Sternberg, practical intelligence includes things like knowing what to say to whom, knowing when to say it, and knowing how to say it for maximum effect. It is procedural. It is about knowing how to do something without necessarily knowing why you know it or being able to explain it. It's practical in nature, that is, it's not knowledge for its own sake. It's knowledge that helps you read situations correctly and get what you want. And, critically, it is a kind of intelligence separate from the sort of analytical ability measured by IQ. To use the technical term, general intelligence and practical intelligence are orthogonal. The presence of one doesn't imply the presence of the other. You can have lots of analytical intelligence and very little practical intelligence, or lots of practical intelligence and not much analytical intelligence, or, as in the lucky case of someone like Robert Oppenheimer, you can have lots of both. So where does something like practical intelligence come from? We know where analytical intelligence comes from. It's something, at least in part, that's in your genes. Chris Langan started talking at 6 months. He taught himself to read at 3 years of age. He was born smart. IQ is a measure, to some degree, of innate ability. But social savvy is knowledge. It's a set of skills that have to be learned. It has to come from somewhere, and the place where we seem to get these kinds of attitudes and skills is from our families. Perhaps the best explanation we have of this process comes from the sociologist Annette Leroux, who a few years ago conducted a fascinating study of a group of third graders. She picked both blacks and whites and children from both wealthy homes and poor homes, zeroing in, ultimately, on 12 families. LaRoe and her team visited each family at least 20 times, for hours at a stretch. She and her assistants told their subjects to treat them like the family dog, and they followed them to church and to soccer games and to doctor's appointments, with a tape recorder in one hand and a notebook in the other. You might expect that if you spent such an extended period in 12 different households, what you would gather is 12 different ideas about how to raise children. There would be the strict parents and the lax parents and the hyper-involved parents and the mellow parents and on and on. What LaRoe found, however, is something much different. There were only two parenting philosophies, and they divided almost perfectly along class lines. The wealthier parents raised their kids one way, and the poorer parents raised their kids another way. The wealthier parents were heavily involved in their children's free time, shuttling them from one activity to the next, quizzing them about their teachers and coaches and teammates. One of the well-off children LaRoe followed played on a baseball team, 2 soccer teams, a swim team, and a basketball team in the summer, as well as playing in an orchestra and taking piano lessons. That kind of intensive scheduling was almost entirely absent from the lives of the poor children. Play for them wasn't soccer practice twice a week. It was making up games outside with their siblings and other kids in the neighborhood. What a child did was considered by his or her parents as something separate from the adult world and not particularly consequential. One girl from a working-class family, Katie Brindle, sang in a choir after school. But she signed up for it herself and walked to choir practice on her own. LaRoe writes, "What Mrs. Brindle doesn't do that is routine for middle-class mothers is view her daughter's interest in singing as a signal to look for other ways to help her develop that interest into a formal talent. Similarly, Mrs. Brindle does not discuss Katie's interest in drama or express regret that she cannot afford to cultivate her daughter's talent. Instead, she frames Katie's skills and interests as character traits. Singing and acting are part of what makes Katie Katie. She sees the shows her daughter puts on as cute and as a way for Katie to get attention." The middle-class parents talked things through with their children, reasoning with them. They didn't just issue commands. They expected their children to talk back to them, to negotiate, to question adults in positions of authority. If their children were doing poorly at school, the wealthier parents challenged their teachers. They intervened on behalf of their kids. One child LaRoe follows just misses qualifying for a gifted program. Her mother arranges for her to be retested privately, petitions the school, and gets her daughter admitted. The poor parents, by contrast, are intimidated by authority. They react passively and stay in the background. LaRoe writes of one low-income parent. "At a parent-teacher conference, for example, Miss McAllister seems subdued. The gregarious and outgoing nature she displays at home is hidden in this setting. She sits hunched over in the chair and she keeps her jacket zipped up. She is very quiet. When the teacher reports that Harold has not been turning in his homework, Ms. McAllister clearly is flabbergasted, but all she says is, 'He did it at home.' She does not follow up with the teacher or attempt to intervene on Harold's behalf. In her view, it is up to the teachers to manage her son's education. That is their job, not hers." LaRoe calls the middle-class parenting style concerted cultivation. It's an attempt to actively foster and assess a child's talents, opinions, and skills. Poor parents tend to follow, by contrast, a strategy of accomplishment of natural growth. They see as their responsibility to care for their children but to let them grow and develop on their own. LaRoe stresses that one style isn't morally better than the other. The poorer children were, to her mind, often better behaved, less whiny, more creative in making use of their own time, and had a well-developed sense of independence. But in practical terms, concerted cultivation has enormous advantages. The heavily scheduled middle-class child is exposed to a constantly shifting set of experiences. She learns teamwork and how to cope in highly structured settings. She is taught how to interact comfortably with adults, and to speak up when she needs to. In Leroux's words, the middle-class children learn a sense of entitlement. The best sense of the term, they acted as though they had a right to pursue their own individual preferences and to actively manage interactions in institutional settings. They appeared comfortable in those settings, they were open to sharing information and asking for attention. It was common practice among middle-class children to shift interactions to suit their preferences. They knew the rules. Even in 4th grade, middle-class children appeared to be acting on their own behalf to gain advantages. They made special requests of teachers and doctors to adjust procedures to accommodate their desires. By contrast, the working class and poor children were characterized by an emerging sense of distance, distrust, and constraint. They didn't know how to get their way, or how to customize, using Leroux's wonderful term, whatever environment they were in, for their best purposes. In one telling scene, Leroux describes a visit to the doctor by Alex Williams, a 9-year-old boy, and his mother, Christina. The Williamses are wealthy professionals. "Alex, you should be thinking of questions you might want to ask the doctor," Christina says in the car on the way to the doctor's office. "You can ask him anything you want. Don't be shy. You can ask anything." Alex thinks for a minute, then says, "I have some bumps under my arms from my deodorant." "Christina, really? You mean from your new deodorant?" Alex, "Yes." Christina, "Well, you should ask the doctor." Alex's mother, Leroux writes, is teaching that he has the right to speak up, that even though he's going to be in a room with an older person and authority figure, it's perfectly all right for him to assert himself. They meet the doctor, a genial man in his early 40s. He tells Alex that he is in the 95th percentile in height. Alex then interrupts. "Alex, I'm in the what?" "Doctor, it means that you're taller than more than 95 out of 100 young men when they're, 10 years old." "Alex, I'm not 10. "Doctor, well, they graphed you at 10. You're 9 years and 10 months. They usually take the closest year to that graph." Look at how easily Alex interrupts the doctor, "I'm not 10. That's entitlement. His mother permits that casual incivility because she wants him to learn to assert himself with people in positions of authority. The doctor turns to Alex. "Well, now the most important question. Do you have any questions you want to ask me before I do your physical?" Alex, only one. I've been getting some bumps on my arms, right around here." "Doctor, underneath?" Alex, "Yeah." "Doctor, okay. I'll have to take a look at those when I come in closer to do the checkup. And I'll see what they are and what I can do. Do they hurt or itch?" Alex, "No, they're just there." "Doctor, okay, I'll take a look at those bumps for you." This kind of interaction simply doesn't happen with lower-class children, Leroux says. They would be quiet and submissive, with eyes turned away. Alex takes charge of the moment. In remembering to raise the question he prepared in advance, he gains the doctor's full attention and focuses it on an issue of his choosing, Leroux writes. In so doing, he successfully shifts the balance of power away from the adults and toward himself. The transition goes smoothly. Alex is used to being treated with respect. He is seen as special and as a person worthy of adult attention and interest. These are key characteristics of the strategy of concerted cultivation. Alex is not showing off during his checkup. He is behaving much as he does with his parents. He reasons, negotiates, and jokes with equal ease. It is important to understand where the particular mastery of that moment comes from. It's not genetic. Alex Williams didn't inherit the skills to interact with authority figures from his parents and grandparents the way he inherited the color of his eyes. Nor is it racial. It's not a practice specific to either black or white people. As it turns out, Alex Williams is black and Katie Brindle is white. It's a cultural advantage. Alex has those skills because over the course of his young life, his mother and father, in the manner of educated families, have painstakingly taught them to him, nudging and prodding and encouraging and showing him the rules of the game. Right down to that little rehearsal in the car on the way to the doctor's office. When we talk about the advantages of class, Leroux argues, this is in large part what we mean. Alex Williams is better off than Katie Brindle because he's wealthier and because he goes to a better school, but also because, and perhaps this is even more critical, the sense of entitlement that he has been taught is an attitude perfectly suited to succeeding in the modern world. 4. This is the advantage that Oppenheimer had and that Chris Langan lacked. Oppenheimer was raised in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Manhattan, the son of an artist and a successful garment manufacturer. His childhood was the embodiment of concerted cultivation. On weekends, the Oppenheimers would go driving in the countryside in a chauffeur-driven Packard. Summers he would be taken to Europe to see his grandfather. He attended the Ethical Culture School on Central Park West, perhaps the most progressive school in the nation, where, his biographers write, students were infused with the notion that they were being groomed to reform the world. When his math teacher realized he was bored, she sent him off to do independent work. As a child, Oppenheimer was passionate about rock collecting. At the age of 12, he began corresponding with local geologists about rock formations he had seen in Central Park, and he so impressed them that they invited him to give a lecture before the New York Mineralogical Club. As Sherwin and Bird write, Oppenheimer's parents responded to their son's hobby in an almost textbook example of concerted cultivation. Dreading the thought of having to talk to an audience of adults, Robert begged his father to explain that they had invited a 12-year-old. Greatly amused, Julius encouraged his son to accept this honor. On the designated evening, Robert showed up at the club with his parents, who proudly introduced their son as J. Robert Oppenheimer. The startled audience of geologists and amateur rock collectors burst out laughing when he stepped up to the podium. A wooden box had to be found for him to stand on so that the audience could see more than the shock of his wiry black hair sticking up above the lectern. Shy and awkward, Robert nevertheless read his prepared remarks and was given a hearty round of applause. Are someone whose father has made his way up in the business world, then you've seen, firsthand, what it means to negotiate your way out of a tight spot. If you're someone who was sent to the Ethical Culture School, then you aren't going to be intimidated by a row of Cambridge dons arrayed in judgment against you. If you studied physics at Harvard, then you know how to talk to an army general who did engineering just down the road at MIT. Chris Langan, by contrast, had only the bleakness of Bozeman and a home dominated by an angry, drunken stepfather. Langan did this to all of us, said Mark. We all have a true resentment of authority. That was the lesson Langan learned from his childhood: distrust authority and be independent. He never had a parent teach him on the way to the doctor how to speak up for himself, or how to reason and negotiate with those in positions of authority. He didn't learn entitlement. He learned constraint. It may seem like a small thing, but it was a crippling handicap in navigating the world beyond Bozeman. I couldn't get any financial aid either, Mark went on. We just had zero knowledge, less than zero knowledge, of the process. How to apply the forms, checkbooks. It was not our environment. If Christopher had been born into a wealthy family, if he was the son of a doctor who was well connected in some major market, I guarantee you he would have been one of those guys you read about, knocking back PhDs at 17, his brother Jeff says. It's the culture you find yourself in that determines that. The issue with Chris is that he was always too bored to actually sit there and listen to his teachers. If someone had recognized his intelligence and if he was from a family where there was some kind of value on education, they would have made sure he wasn't bored. 5. When the termites were into their adulthood, Turman looked at the records of 730 of the men and divided them into 3 groups. 150, the top 20%, fell into what Turman called the A group. They were the true success stories, the stars, the lawyers and physicians and engineers and academics. 90% of the A's graduated from college, and among them had earned 98 graduate degrees. The middle 60% were the B group, those who were doing satisfactorily. The bottom 150 were the CS, the ones who Turman judged to have done the least with their superior mental ability. They were the postal workers and the struggling bookkeepers and the men lying on their couches at home without any job at all. 1/3 of the CS were college dropouts. A quarter only had a high school diploma, and all 150 of the CS, each one of whom, at one point in his life, had been dubbed a genius, had together earned a grand total of 8 graduate degrees. What was the difference between the AS and the CS? Turman ran through every conceivable explanation. He looked at their physical and mental health, their masculinity-femininity scores, and their hobbies and vocational interests. He compared the ages when they started walking and talking and what their precise IQ scores were in elementary and high school. In the end, only one thing mattered: family background. The As overwhelmingly came from the middle and the upper class. Their homes were filled with books. Half the fathers of the A group had a college degree or beyond, and this at a time when a university education was a rarity. The CS, on the other hand, were from the other side of the tracks. Almost a third of them had a parent who had dropped out of school before the 8th grade. Groups and rate their personalities and manner. What they found is everything you would expect to find if you were comparing children raised in an atmosphere of concerted cultivation with children raised in an atmosphere of natural growth. The As were judged to be much more alert, poised, attractive, and well-dressed. In fact, the scores on those 4 dimensions are so different as to make you think you are looking at 2 different species of humans. You aren't, of course. You're simply seeing the difference between those schooled by their families to present their best face to the world, and those denied that experience. The Turman results are deeply distressing. Let's not forget how highly gifted the C group was. If you had met them at 5 or 6 years of age, you would have been overwhelmed by their curiosity and mental agility and sparkle. They were true outliers. The plain truth of the Turman study, however, is that in the end almost none of the genius children from the lowest social and economic class ended up making a name for themselves. What did the CS lack, though? Not something expensive or impossible to find, not something encoded in DNA or hardwired into the circuits of their brains. They lacked something that could have been given to them if we'd only known they needed it, a community around them that prepared them properly for the world. The CS were squandered talent. But they didn't need to be. 6. Today, Chris Langan lives in rural Missouri on a horse farm. He moved there a few years ago, after he got married. He is in his 50s but looks many years younger. He has the build of a linebacker, thick through the chest, with enormous biceps. His hair is combed straight back from his forehead. He has a neat, graying mustache and aviator-style glasses. If you look into his eyes, you can see the intelligence burning behind them. A typical day is, I get up and make coffee. I go in and sit in front of the computer and begin working on whatever I was working on the night before, he told me not long ago. I found if I go to bed with a question on my mind, all I have to do is concentrate on the question before I go to sleep and I virtually always have the answer in the morning. Sometimes I realize what the answer is because I dreamt the answer and I can remember it. Other times I just feel the answer, and I start typing and the answer emerges onto the page. He had just been reading the work of the linguist Noam Chomsky. There were piles of books in his study. He ordered books from the library all the time. I always feel that the closer you get to the original sources, the better off you are, he said. Langan seemed content. He had farm animals to take care of, and books to read, and a wife he loved. It was a much better life than being a bouncer. I don't think there is anyone smarter than me out there, he went on. I have never met anybody like me or never seen even an indication that there is somebody who actually has better powers of comprehension. Never seen it and I don't think I am going to. I could, my mind is open to the possibility. If anyone should challenge me. Oh, I think that I am smarter than you are, I think I could have them. What he said sounded boastful, but it wasn't really. It was the opposite, a touch defensive. He'd been working for decades now on a project of enormous sophistication, but almost none of what he had done had ever been published, much less read by the physicists and philosophers and mathematicians who might be able to judge its value. Here he was, a man with a 1-in-a-million mind, and he had yet to have any impact on the world. He wasn't holding forth at academic conferences. He wasn't leading a graduate seminar at some prestigious university. He was living on a slightly tumble-down horse farm in northern Missouri, sitting on the back porch in jeans and a cut-off t-shirt. He knew how it looked. It was the great paradox of Chris Langan's genius. "I have not pursued mainstream publishers as hard as I should have," he conceded. "Going around, querying publishers, trying to find an agent. I haven't done it, and I am not interested in doing it." It was an admission of defeat. Every experience he had had outside of his own mind had ended in frustration. He knew he needed to do a better job of navigating the world, but he didn't know how. He couldn't even talk to his calculus teacher, for goodness sake. These were things that others, with lesser minds, could master easily. But that's because those others had had help along the way, and Chris Langan never had. It wasn't an excuse. It was a fact. He'd had to make his way alone, and no one, not rock stars, not professional athletes, not software billionaires, and not even geniuses, ever makes it alone. Chapter 5. The 3 Lessons of Joe Flom. Mary got a quarter. 1. Joe Flom is the last living named partner of the law firm Skadden, ARPs, Slate, Maher and Flom. He has a corner office high atop the Condé Nast Tower in Manhattan. He is short and slightly hunched. His head is large, framed by long prominent ears, and his narrow blue eyes are hidden by oversized aviator-style glasses. He is slender now, but during his heyday, Flom was extremely overweight. He waddles when he walks. He doodles when he thinks. He mumbles when he talks, and when he makes his way down the halls of Skadden, ARPs, conversations drop to a hush. Flom grew up in the Depression in Brooklyn's Borough Park neighborhood. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. His father, Isidore, was a union organizer in the garment industry who later went to work sewing shoulder pads for ladies' dresses. His mother worked at what was called piecework, doing applique at home. They were desperately poor. His family moved nearly every year when he was growing up because the custom in those days was for landlords to give new tenants a month's free rent, and without that, his family could not get by. In junior high school, Flom took the entrance exam for the elite Townsend Harris Public High School on Lexington Avenue in Manhattan, a school that in just 40 years of existence produced 3 Nobel Prize winners, 6 Pulitzer Prize winners, and 1 Supreme Court justice. Not to mention George Gershwin and Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine. He got in. His mother would give him a dime in the morning for breakfast, 3 donuts, orange juice, and coffee at Nettix. After school, he pushed a hand truck in the garment district. He did 2 years of night school at City College in Upper Manhattan, working during the days to make ends meet, signed up for the Army, served his time, and applied to Harvard Law School. "I wanted to get into the law since I was 6 years old," Flom says. He didn't have a degree from college. Harvard took him anyway. Why? "I wrote them a letter on why I was the answer to sliced bread," is how Flom explains it, with characteristic brevity. At Harvard, in the late 1940s, he never took notes. "All of us were going through this first-year idiocy of writing notes carefully in the classroom and doing an outline of that, then a condensation of that, and then doing it again on onionskin paper, on top of other paper," remembers Charles Haar, who was a classmate of Flom's. It was a routinized way of trying to learn the cases. Not Joe. He wouldn't have any of that. But he had that quality which we always vaguely subsumed under thinking like a lawyer. He had the great capacity for judgment. Flom was named to the Law Review, an honor reserved for the very top students in the class. During hiring season, the Christmas break of his second year, he went down to New York to interview with the big corporate law firms of the day. "I was ungainly, awkward, a fat kid. I didn't feel comfortable," Flom remembers. "I was one of 2 kids in my class at the end of hiring season who didn't have a job. Then one day, one of my professors said that there are these guys starting a firm. I had a visit with them, and the entire time I met with them, they were telling me what the risks were of going with a firm that didn't have a client. The more they talked, the more I liked them. So I said, what the hell, I'll take a chance." They had to scrape together the $3,600 a year, which was the starting salary. In the beginning, it was Just Marshall Skadden, Leslie ARPs, both of whom had just been turned down for partner at a major Wall Street law firm, and John Slate, who had worked for Pan Am Airlines. Flom was their associate. They had a tiny suite of offices on the top floor of the Lehman Brothers building on Wall Street. "What kind of law did we do?" Flom says, laughing. "Whatever came in the door." In 1954, Flom took over as Skadden's managing partner, and the firm began to grow by leaps and bounds. Soon it had 100 lawyers. Then 200. When it hit 300, one of Flom's partners, Morris Kramer, came to him and said that he felt guilty about bringing in young law school graduates. Skadden was so big, Kramer said, that it was hard to imagine the firm growing beyond that and being able to promote any of those hires. Flom told him, "We'll go to 1,000. Flom never lacked for ambition. Today Skadden, ARPs has nearly 2,000 attorneys in 23 offices around the world and earns well over $1 billion a year, making it one of the largest and most powerful law firms in the world. In his office, Flom has pictures of himself with George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton. He lives in a sprawling apartment in a luxurious building on Manhattan's Upper East Side. For a period of almost 30 years, if you were a Fortune 500 company about to be taken over or trying to take over someone else, or merely a big shot in some kind of fix, Joseph Flom has been your attorney and Skadden, ARPs has been your law firm, and if they weren't, you probably wished they were. 2. I hope by now that you are skeptical of this kind of story. Brilliant immigrant kid overcomes poverty and the Depression, can't get a job at the stuffy downtown law firms, makes it on his own through sheer hustle and ability. It's a rags to riches story, and everything we've learned so far from hockey players and software billionaires and the termites suggests that success doesn't happen that way. Successful people don't do it alone. Where they come from matters. They're products of particular places and environments. Just as we did, then, with Bill Joy and Chris Langan, let's start over with Joseph Flom, this time putting to use everything we've learned from the first 4 chapters of this book. No more talk of Joe Flom's intelligence, or personality, or ambition, though he obviously has these 3 things in abundance. No glowing quotations from his clients, testifying to his genius. No more colorful tales from the meteoric rise of Skadden, ARPs, Slate, Marr, and Flom. Instead, I'm going to tell a series of stories from the New York immigrant world that Joe Flom grew up in, of a fellow law student, a father and son named Maurice and Mort Janklow, and an extraordinary couple by the name of Louis and Regina Borgenicht, in the hopes of answering a critical question. What were Joe Flom's opportunities? Since we know that outliers always have help along the way, can we sort through the ecology of Joe Flom and identify the conditions that helped create him? We tell rags to riches stories because we find something captivating in the idea of a lone hero battling overwhelming odds. But the true story of Joe Flom's life turns out to be much more intriguing than the mythological version because all the things in his life that seem to have been disadvantages, that he was a poor child of garment workers, that he was Jewish at a time when Jews were heavily discriminated against, that he grew up in the Depression, turn out, unexpectedly, to have been advantages. Joe Flom is an outlier. But he's not an outlier for the reasons you might think, and the story of his rise provides a blueprint for understanding success in his profession. By the end of the chapter, in fact, we'll see that it is possible to take the lessons of Joe Flom, apply them to the legal world of New York City, and predict the family background, age, and origin of the city's most powerful attorneys, without knowing a single additional fact about them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Lesson number 1, the importance of being Jewish. 3. One of Joe Flom's classmates at Harvard Law School was a man named Alexander Bickel. Like Flom, Bickel was the son of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who lived in the Bronx. Like Flom, Bickel had gone to public school in New York and then to City College. Like Flom, Bickel was a star in his law school class. In fact, before his career was cut short by cancer, Bickel would become perhaps the finest constitutional scholar of his generation. And like Flom and the rest of their law school classmates, Bickel went to Manhattan during hiring season over Christmas of 1947 to find himself a job. His first stop was at Mudge Rose, down on Wall Street, as traditional and stuffy as any firm of that era. Mudge Rose was founded in 1869. It was where Richard Nixon practiced in the years before he won the presidency in 1968. "We're like the lady who only wants her name in the newspaper twice, when she's born and when she dies," one of the senior partners famously said. Bickle was taken around the firm and interviewed by one partner after another, until he was led into the library to meet with the firm's senior partner. You can imagine the scene: a dark-paneled room, an artfully frayed Persian carpet, row upon row of leather-bound legal volumes, oil paintings of Mr. Mudge and Mr. Rose on the wall. "After they put me through the whole interview and everything," Bickle said many years later, "I was brought to who took it upon himself to tell me that for a boy of my antecedents," and you can imagine how Bickle must have paused before repeating that euphemism for his immigrant background, "I certainly had come far. But I ought to understand how limited the possibilities of a firm like his were to hire a boy of my antecedents." And while he congratulated me on my progress, I should understand he certainly couldn't offer me a job. But they all enjoyed seeing me and all that. It is clear from the transcript of Bickle's reminiscences that his interviewer does not quite know what to do with that information. Bickle was by the time of the interview at the height of his reputation. He had argued a case before the Supreme Court. He had written brilliant books. Mudge Rose saying no to Bickle because of his antecedents was like the Chicago Bulls turning down Michael Jordan because they were uncomfortable with black kids from North Carolina. It didn't make any sense. "But for stars?" the interviewer asked, meaning, wouldn't they have made an exception for you? Bickle: "Stars, schmars." In the 1940s and 1950s, the old-line law firms of New York operated like a private club. They were all headquartered in downtown Manhattan, in and around Wall Street, in somber, granite-faced buildings. The partners at the top firms graduated from the same Ivy League schools, attended the same churches, and summered in the same oceanside towns on Long Island. They wore conservative gray suits. Their partnerships were known as white shoe firms, in apparent reference to the white bucks favored at the country club or a cocktail party, and they were very particular in whom they hired. As Irwin Smidgel wrote in The Wall Street Lawyer, his study of the New York legal establishment of that era, they were looking for lawyers who are Nordic, have pleasing personalities and clean-cut appearances, are graduates of the right schools, have the right social background and experience in the affairs of the world, and are endowed with tremendous stamina. A former law school dean, in discussing the qualities students need to obtain a job, offers a somewhat more realistic picture. To get a job should be long enough on family connections, long enough on ability, or long enough on personality, or a combination of these. Something called acceptability is made up of the sum of its parts. If a man has any of these things, he could get a job. If he has two of them, he can have a choice of jobs. If he has three, he could go anywhere. Bickle's hair was not fair. His eyes were not blue. He spoke with an accent, and his family connections consisted, principally, of being the son of Solomon and yet a Bickle of Bucharest, Romania, by way, most recently, of Brooklyn. Flom's credentials were no better. He says he felt uncomfortable when he went for his interviews downtown, and of course he did. He was short and ungainly and Jewish and talked with the flat, nasal tones of his native Brooklyn, and you can imagine how he would have been perceived by some silver-haired patrician in the library. If you were not of the right background and religion and social class and you came out of law school in that era, you joined some smaller, second-rate, upstart law firm on a rung below the big names downtown, or you simply went into business for yourself and took whatever came in the door, that is, whatever legal work the big downtown firms did not want for themselves. That seems horribly unfair, and it was. But as is so often the case with outliers, buried in that setback was a golden opportunity. 4. The old-line Wall Street law firms had a very specific idea about what it was that they did. They were corporate lawyers. They represented the country's largest and most prestigious companies, and represented meant they handled the taxes and the legal work behind the issuing of stocks and bonds and made sure their clients did not run afoul of federal regulators. They did not do litigation, that is, very few of them had a division dedicated to defending and filing lawsuits. As Paul Cravath, one of the founders of Cravath, Swaine and Moore, the very whitest of the white shoe firms, once put it, the lawyer's job was to settle disputes in the conference room, not in the courtroom. Among my classmates at Harvard, the thing that bright young guys did was securities work or tax, another white shoe partner remembers. Those were the distinguished fields. Litigation was for hams, not for serious people. Corporations just didn't sue each other in those days. What the old line firms also did not do was involve themselves in hostile corporate takeovers. It's hard to imagine today, when corporate raiders and private equity firms are constantly swallowing up one company after another, but until the 1970s, it was considered scandalous for one company to buy another company without the target agreeing to be bought. Places like Mudge Rose and the other establishment firms on Wall Street would not touch those kinds of deals. The problem with hostile takeovers is that they were hostile, says Stephen Brill, who founded the trade magazine American Lawyer. It wasn't gentlemanly. If your best buddy from Princeton is the CEO of Company X, and he's been coasting for a long time, and some corporate raider shows up and says this company sucks, it makes you uncomfortable. You think, if he goes, then maybe I go too. It's this whole notion of not. The work that came in the door to the generation of Jewish lawyers from the Bronx and Brooklyn in the 1950s and 1960s, then, was the work the white shoe firms disdained, litigation and, more important, proxy fights, which were the legal maneuvers at the center of any hostile takeover bid. An investor would take an interest in a company, he would denounce the management as incompetent and send letters to shareholders, trying to get them to give him their proxy so he could vote out the firm's executives. And to run the proxy fight, the only lawyer the investor could get was someone like Joe Flom. In Skadden, the legal historian Lincoln Kaplan describes that early world of takeovers, the winner of a proxy contest was determined in the snake pit. Lawyers for each side met with inspectors of elections, whose job it was to approve or eliminate questionable proxies. The event was often informal, contentious, and unruly. Adversaries were sometimes in t-shirts, eating watermelon or sharing a bottle of scotch. In rare cases, the results of the snake pit could swing the outcome of a contest and turn on a single ballot. Lawyers occasionally tried to fix an election by engineering the appointment of inspectors who were beholden to them. Inspectors commonly smoked cigars provided by each side. Management's lawyer would contest the proxies of the insurgents and vice versa. Lawyers who prevailed in the snake pit excelled at winging it. There were lawyers who knew more about the rules of proxy contests, but no one was better in a fight than Joe Flom. Flom was fat, physically unattractive, and indifferent to social niceties. But in the judgment of colleagues and of some adversaries, his will to win was unsurpassed and he was often masterful. The white shoe law firms would call in Flom as well whenever some corporate raider made a run at one of their establishment clients. They wouldn't touch the case. But they were happy to outsource it to Skadden, ARPs. Flom's early specialty was proxy fights, and that was not what we did, just like we don't do matrimonial work, said Robert Rifkind, a longtime partner at Cravath, Swaine and Moore. And therefore we purported not to know about it. I remember once we had an issue involving a proxy fight, and one of my senior corporate partners said, "Well, let's get Joe in." And he came to a conference room, and we all sat around and described the problem and he told us what to do and he left. And I said, "We can do that too, you know." And the partners said, No, you can't. We're not going to do that. It was just that we didn't do it." Then came the 1970s. The old aversion to lawsuits fell by the wayside. It became easier to borrow money. Federal regulations were relaxed. Markets became internationalized. Investors became more aggressive, and the result was a boom in the number and size of corporate takeovers. In 1980, if you went to the Business Roundtable and took surveys about whether hostile takeovers should be allowed, 2/3 would have said no, Flom said. Now, the vote would be almost unanimously yes. Companies needed to be defended against lawsuits from rivals. Hostile suitors needed to be beaten back. Investors who wanted to devour unwilling targets needed help with their legal strategy, and shareholders needed formal representation. The Dollar figures involved were enormous. From the mid-1970s to the end of the 1980s, the amount of money involved in mergers and acquisitions every year on Wall Street increased 2,000%, peaking at almost $250 billion. All of a sudden the things that the old-line law firms didn't want to do, hostile takeovers and litigation, were the things that every law firm wanted to do. And who was the expert in these two suddenly critical areas of law? The once marginal, second-tier law firms started by the people who couldn't get jobs at the downtown firms 10 and 15 years earlier. Thought hostile takeovers were beneath contempt until relatively late in the game, and until they decided that, hey, maybe we ought to be in that business, they left me alone, Flom said. And once you get the reputation for doing that kind of work, the business comes to you first. Think of how similar this is to the stories of Bill Joy and Bill Gates. Both of them toiled away in a relatively obscure field without any great hopes for worldly success. But then, boom, the personal computer revolution happened, and they had their 10,000 hours in. They were ready. Flom had the same experience. For 20 years he perfected his craft at Skadden, ARPs. Then the world changed and he was ready. He didn't triumph over adversity. Instead, what started out as adversity ended up being an opportunity. It's not that those guys were smarter lawyers than anyone else, Rifkin says. It's that they had a skill that they had been working on for years that was suddenly very valuable. Lesson number 2, demographic luck. 5. Maurice Janklow enrolled in Brooklyn Law School in 1919. He was the eldest son of Jewish immigrants from Romania. He had 7 brothers and sisters. One ended up running a small department store in Brooklyn. 2 others were in the haberdashery business, one had a graphic design studio, another made feather hats, and another worked in the finance department at Tishman Realty. Maurice, however, was the family intellectual, the only one to go to college. He got his law degree and set up a practice on Court Street in downtown Brooklyn. He was an elegant man who dressed in a Homburg and Brooks Brothers suits. In the summer, he wore a straw boater. He married the very beautiful Lillian Levanton, who was the daughter of a prominent Talmudist. He drove a big car. He moved to Queens. He and a partner then took over a writing paper business that gave every indication of making a fortune. Here was a man who looked, for all the world, like the kind of person who should thrive as a lawyer in New York City. He was intelligent and educated. He came from a family well schooled in the rules of the system. He was living in the most economically vibrant city in the world. But here is the strange thing, it never happened. Maurice Janklow's career did not take off the way that he'd hoped. In his mind, he never really made it beyond Court Street in Brooklyn. He struggled and floundered. Maurice Janklow had a son named Mort, however, who became a lawyer as well, and the son's story is very different from that of the father. Mort Janklow built a law firm from scratch in the 1960s, then put together one of the very earliest cable television franchises and sold it for a fortune to Cox Broadcasting. He started a literary agency in the 1970s, and it is today one of the most prestigious in the world. He has his own plane. Every dream that eluded the father was fulfilled by the son. Why did Mort Janklow succeed where Maurice Janklow did not? There are, of course, 100 potential answers to that question. But let's take a page from the analysis of the business tycoons born in the 1830s and the software programmers born in 1955 and look at the differences between the two Janklows in terms of their generation. Is there a perfect time for a New York Jewish lawyer to be born? It turns out there is, and this same fact that helps explain Mort Janklow's success is the second key to Joe Flom's success as well. 6. Louis Turman's genius study, as you will recall from the chapter about Chris Langan, was an investigation into how some children with really high IQs who were born between 1903 and 1917 turned out as adults. And the study found that there was a group of real successes and there was a group of real failures, and that the successes were far more likely to have come from wealthier families. In that sense, the Turman study underscores the argument Annette Leroux makes, that what your parents do for a living, and the assumptions that accompany the class your parents belong to, matter. There's another way to break down the Turman results, though, and that's by when the termites were born. If you divide the termites into two groups, with those born between 1903 and 1911 on one side, and those between 1912 and 1917 on the other, it turns out that the Turman failures are far more likely to have been born in the earlier group. The explanation has to do with two of the great cataclysmic events of the 20th century, the Great Depression and World War II. If you were born after 1912, say, in 1915, you got out of college after the worst of the Depression was over, and you were drafted at a young enough age that going away to war for 3 or 4 years was as much an opportunity as it was a disruption. The termites born before 1911, though, graduated from college at the height of the Depression, when job opportunities were scarce, and they were already in their late 30s when the Second World War hit, meaning that when they were drafted, they had to disrupt careers and families and adult lives that were already well underway. To have been born before 1911 is to have been demographically unlucky. The most devastating events of the 20th century hit you at exactly the wrong time. This same demographic logic applies to Jewish lawyers in New York like Maurice Janclow. The doors were closed to them at the big downtown law firms. So they were overwhelmingly solo practitioners, handling wills and divorces and contracts and minor disputes, and in the Depression the work of the solo practitioner all but disappeared. Nearly half of the members of the Metropolitan Bar earned less than the minimum subsistence level for American families, Gerald Auerbach writes of the Depression years in New York. 1 year later 1,500 lawyers were prepared to take the pauper's oath to qualify for work relief. Jewish lawyers discovered that their practice had become a dignified road to starvation. Regardless of the number of years they had spent in practice, their income was strikingly less than that of their Christian colleagues. Maurice Janclow was born in 1902. When the Depression started, he was newly married and had just bought his big car, moved to Queens, and made his great gamble on the writing paper business. His timing could not have been worse. Depression killed him economically. He didn't have any reserves, and he had no family to fall back on. And from then on, he became very much a Scrivener-type lawyer. He didn't have the courage to take risks after that. It was too much for him. My father used to close titles for $25. He had a friend who worked at the Jamaica Savings Bank who would throw him some business. He would kill himself for $25, doing the whole closing, title reports. For $25. I can remember my father and mother in the morning, Janclow continued. He would say to her, I got $1.75. I need 10 cents for the bus, 10 cents for the subway, a quarter for a sandwich, and he would give her the rest. They were that close to the edge. 7. Now contrast that experience with the experience of someone who, like Mort Janclow, was born in the 1930s. Take a look at the following chart, which shows the birth rates in the United States from 1910 to 1950. In 1915, there are almost 3 million babies. In 1935, that number drops by almost 600,000, and then, within a decade and a half, the number is back over 3 million again. To put it in more precise terms, for every 1,000 Americans, there were 29.5 babies born in 1915, 7 babies born in 1935, and 24.1 babies born in 1950. The decade of the 1930s is what is called a demographic trough. In response to the economic hardship of the Depression, families simply stopped having children, and as a result, the generation born during that decade was markedly smaller than both the generation that preceded it and the generation that immediately followed it. Year total births per 1,000 1910 2,777,000. 30.1 1915 2,965,000. 29.5 1920 2,950,000. 27.7 1925 2,909,000. 25.1 1930 2,618,000. 21.3 1935 2,377,000. 18.7 1940 2,559,000. 19.4 1945 2,858,000. 20.4 1953,632,000. 24.1. Here is what the economist H. Scott Gordon once wrote about the particular benefits of being one of those people born in a small generation. When he opens his eyes for the first time, it is in a spacious hospital, well appointed to serve the wave that preceded him. The staff is generous with their time, since they have little to do while they ride out the brief period of calm until the next wave hits. When he comes to school age, the magnificent buildings are already there to receive him, the ample staff of teachers welcomes him with open arms. In high school, the basketball team is not as good as it was, but there is no problem getting time on the gymnasium floor. The university is a delightful place, lots of room in the classes and residences, no crowding in the cafeteria, and the professors are solicitous. Then he hits the job market. The supply of new entrants is low, and the demand is high, because there is a large wave coming behind him providing a strong demand for the goods and services of his potential employers. In New York City, the early 1930s cohort was so small that class sizes were at least half of what they had been 25 years earlier. The schools were new, built for the big generation that had come before, and the teachers had what in them. The New York City public schools of the 1940s were considered the best schools in the country, says Diane Ravitch, a professor at New York University who has written widely on the city's educational history. There was this generation of educators in the 30s and 40s who would have been in another time and place college professors. They were brilliant, but they couldn't get the jobs they wanted, and public teaching was what they did because it was security and it had a pension and you didn't get laid off. The same dynamic benefited the members of that generation when they went off to college. Here is Ted Friedman, one of the top litigators in New York in the 1970s and 1980s. Like Flom, he grew up poor, the child of struggling Jewish immigrants. My options were City College and the University of Michigan, Friedman said. City College was free, and Michigan, then, as now, one of the top universities in the United States, was $450 a year. And the thing was, after the first year, you could get a scholarship if your grades were high, Friedman said. So it was only the first year I had to pay that, if I did well. Friedman's first inclination was to stay in New York. Well, I went to City College for one day, I didn't like it. I thought, this is going to be 4 more years of Bronx science, and came home, packed my bags, and hitchhiked to Ann Arbor. He went on. I had a couple of $100 in my pocket from the summer. I was working the Catskills to make enough money to pay the $450 tuition, and I had some left over. Then there was this fancy restaurant in Ann Arbor where I got a job waiting tables. I also worked the night shift at River Rouge, the big Ford plant. That was real money. It wasn't so hard to get that job. The factories were looking for people. I had another job too, which paid me the best pay I ever had before I became a lawyer, which was working in construction. During the summer, in Ann Arbor, we built the Chrysler Proving Grounds. I worked there a few summers during law school. Those jobs were really high-paying, probably because you worked so much overtime. Think about this story for a moment. The first lesson is that Friedman was willing to work hard, take responsibility for himself, and put himself through school. But the second, perhaps more important lesson is that he happened to come along at a time in America when if you were willing to work hard, you could take responsibility for yourself and put yourself through school. Friedman was, at the time, what we would today call economically disadvantaged. He was an inner-city kid from the Bronx, neither of whose parents went to college. But look at how easy it was for him to get a good education. He graduated from his public high school in New York at a time when New York City public schools were the envy of the world. His first option, City College, was free, and his second option, the University of Michigan, cost just $450, and the admissions process was casual enough, apparently, that he could try one school one day and the other the next. And how did he get there? He hitchhiked, with the money that he made in the summer in his pocket, and when he arrived, he immediately got a series of really good jobs to help pay his way, because the factories were looking for people. And of course they were, They had to feed the needs of the big generation just ahead of those born in the demographic trough of the 1930s, and the big generation of baby boomers coming up behind them. The sense of possibility so necessary for success comes not just from inside us or from our parents. It comes from our time, from the particular opportunities that our particular place in history presents us with. For a young would-be lawyer, being born in the early 1930s was a magic time, just as being born in 1955 was for a software programmer, or being born in 1835 was for an entrepreneur. Today, Mort Janklow has an office high above Park Avenue filled with gorgeous works of modern art, a Dubuffet, and Anselm Kiefer. He tells hilarious stories. My mother had 2 sisters. One lived to be 99 and the other died at 90. The 99-year-old was a smart woman. She married my Uncle Al, who was the chief of sales for Maidenform. Once I said to him, "What's the rest of the country like, Uncle Al?" And he said, "Kiddo, when you leave New York, every place is Bridgeport." He gives the sense that the world is his for the taking. I've always been a big risk taker, he says. When I built the cable company, in the early stages, I was making deals where I would have been bankrupt if I hadn't pulled it off. I had confidence that I could make it work. Mort Janklow went to New York City public schools when they were at their best. Maurice Janklow went to New York City public schools when they were at their most overcrowded. Mort Janklow went to Columbia University Law School, because demographic trough babies have their pick of selective schools. Maurice Janklow went to Brooklyn Law School, which was as good as an immigrant child could do in 1919. Mort Janklow sold his cable business for tens of millions of dollars. Maurice Janklow closed titles for $25. The story of the Janklows tells us that the meteoric rise of Joe Flom could not have happened at just any time. Even the most gifted of lawyers, equipped with the best of family lessons, cannot escape the limitations of their generation. My mother was coherent until the last 5 or 6 months of her life, Mort Janklow said. And in her delirium she talked about things that she'd never talked about before. She shed tears over her friends dying in the 1918 flu epidemic. That generation, my parents' generation, lived through a lot. They lived through that epidemic, which took, what? 10% of the world's population. Panic in the streets. Friends dying. And then the First World War, then the Depression, then the Second World War. They didn't have much of a chance. That was a very tough period. My father would have been much more successful in a different kind of world. Lesson number 3, the garment industry and meaningful work. 8. In 1889, Louis and Regina Borgenicht boarded an ocean liner in Hamburg bound for America. Louis was from Galicia, in what was then Poland. Regina was from a small town in Hungary. They had been married only a few years and had 1 small child and a second on the way. For the 13-day journey, they slept on straw. Mattresses on a deck above the engine room, hanging tight to their bunk beds as the ship pitched and rolled. They knew one person in New York, Borgenicht's sister, Sally, who had immigrated 10 years before. They had enough money to last a few weeks, at best. Like so many other immigrants to America in those years, theirs was a leap of faith. Louis and Regina found a tiny apartment on Eldridge Street, on Manhattan's Lower East Side, for $8 a month. Louis then took to the streets, looking for work. He saw peddlers and fruit sellers and sidewalks crammed with pushcarts. The noise and activity and energy dwarfed what he had known in the old world. He was first overwhelmed, then invigorated. He went to his sister's fish store on Ludlow Street and persuaded her to give him a consignment of herring on credit. He set up shop on the sidewalk with 2 barrels of fish, hopping back and forth between them and chanting in German. For frying, for baking, for cooking, good also for eating. Herring will do for every meal, and for every class. By the end of the week, he had cleared $8. By the second week, $13. Those were considerable sums. But Louis and Regina could not see how selling herring on the street would lead to a constructive business. Louis then decided to try being a pushcart peddler. He sold towels and tablecloths, without much luck. he switched to notebooks, then bananas, then socks and stockings. Was there really a future in pushcarts? Regina gave birth to a second child, a daughter, and Louis's urgency grew. He now had 4 mouths to feed. The answer came to him after 5 long days of walking up and down the streets of the Lower East Side, just as he was about to give up hope. He was sitting on an overturned box, eating a late lunch of the sandwiches Regina had made for him. It was clothes. Everywhere around him stores were opening, suits, dresses, overalls, shirts, skirts, blouses, trousers, all made and ready to be worn. Coming from a world where clothing was sewn at home by hand or made to order by tailors, this was a revelation. To me, the greatest wonder in this was not the mere quantity of garments, although that was a miracle in itself, Borjanic would write years later, after he became a prosperous manufacturer of women's and children's clothing, but the fact that in America even poor people could save all the dreary, time-consuming labor of making their own clothes simply by going into a store and walking out with what they needed. There was a field to go into, a field to thrill to. Borjanic took out a small notebook. Everywhere he went, he wrote down what people were wearing and what was for sale: menswear, women's wear, children's wear. He wanted to find a novel item, something that people would wear that was not being sold in the stores. For 4 more days he walked the streets. On the evening of the final day, as he walked toward home, he saw a half-dozen girls playing hopscotch. One of the girls was wearing a tiny embroidered apron over her dress, cut low in the front with a tie in the back, and it struck him, suddenly, that in his previous days of relentlessly inventorying the clothing shops of the Lower East Side, he had never seen one of those aprons for sale. He came home and told Regina. She had an ancient sewing machine that they had bought upon their arrival in America. The next morning, he went to a dry goods store on Hester Street and bought 100 yards of gingham and 50 yards of white crossbar. He came back to their tiny apartment and laid the goods out on the dining room table. Regina began to cut the gingham, small sizes for toddlers, larger for small children, until she had 40 aprons. She began to sew. At midnight, she went to bed and Louis took up where she had left off. At dawn, she rose and began cutting buttonholes and adding buttons. By 10 in the morning, the aprons were finished. Louis gathered them up over his arm and ventured out onto Hester Street. Children's aprons. Little girls' aprons. Colored ones, 10 cents. White ones, 15 cents. Little girls' aprons. By 1 o'clock, all 40 were gone. "Ma, we've got our business," he shouted out to Regina, after running all the way home from Hester Street. He grabbed her by the waist and began swinging her around and around. Jewish immigrants like the Floms and the Borjanics and the Janklows were not like the other immigrants who came to America in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The Irish and the Italians were peasants, tenant farmers from the impoverished countryside of Europe. Not so the Jews. For centuries in Europe, they had been forbidden to own land, so they had clustered in cities and towns, taking up urban trades and professions. 70% of the Eastern European Jews who came through Ellis Island in the 30 years or so before the First World War had some kind of occupational skill. They had owned small groceries or jewelry stores. They had been bookbinders or watchmakers. Overwhelmingly, though, their experience lay in the clothing trade. They were tailors and dressmakers, hat and cap makers, and furriers and tanners. Louis Borjanic, for example, left the impoverished home of his parents at age 12 to work as a sales clerk in a general store in the Polish town of Brzesko. When the opportunity came to work in knitwear and handlung, he jumped at it. In those days, the piece goods man was clothier to the world, he writes, and of the 3 fundamentals required for life in that simple society, food and shelter were humble. Clothing was the aristocrat. Practitioners of the clothing art, dealers in wonderful cloths from every corner of Europe, traders who visited the centers of industry on their annual buying tours, these were the merchant princes of my youth. Their voices were heard, their weight felt. Borjanic worked in piece goods for a man named Epstein, then moved on to a store in neighboring Jaslow called Brandstadter's. It was there that the young Borjanic learned the ins and outs of all the dozens of different varieties of cloth, to the point where he could run his hand over a fabric and tell you the thread count, the name of the manufacturer, and its place of origin. A few years later, Borjanic moved to Hungary and met Regina. She had been running a dressmaking business since the age of 16. Together they opened a series of small piece goods stores, painstakingly learning the details of small business entrepreneurship. Borjanic's great brainstorm that day on the upturned box, then, did not come from nowhere. He was a veteran of Schnittwarenhandlung, and his wife was a seasoned dressmaker. This was their field. And at the same time as the Borjanics set up shop inside their tiny apartment, thousands of other Jewish immigrants were doing the same thing, putting their sewing and dressmaking and tailoring skills to use, to the point where by 1900, control of the garment industry had passed almost entirely into the hands of the Eastern European newcomers. As Borjanic puts it, the Jews bit deep into the welcoming land and worked like madmen at what they knew. Today, at a time when New York is at the center of an enormous and diversified metropolitan area, it is easy to forget the significance of the set of skills that immigrants like the Borjanics brought to the New World. From the late 19th century through the middle of the 20th century, the garment trade was the largest and most economically vibrant industry in the city. More people worked making clothes in New York than at anything else, and more clothes were manufactured in New York than in any other city in the world. The distinctive buildings that still stand on the lower half of Broadway in Manhattan, from the big 10 and 15-story industrial warehouses in the 20 blocks below Times Square to the cast-iron lofts of Soho and Tribeca, were almost all built to house coat makers and hat makers and lingerie manufacturers and huge rooms of men and women hunched over sewing machines. To come to New York City in the 1890s with a background in dressmaking or sewing or Schnittwarenhandlung was a stroke of extraordinary good fortune. It was like showing up in Silicon Valley in 1986 with 10,000 hours of computer programming already under your belt. There is no doubt that those Jewish immigrants arrived at the perfect time, with the perfect skills, says the sociologist Steven Steinberg. To exploit that opportunity, you had to have certain virtues, and those immigrants worked hard. They sacrificed. They scrimped and saved and invested wisely. But still, you have to remember that the garment industry in those years was growing by leaps and bounds. The economy was desperate for the skills that they possessed. Louis and Regina Borjanic and the thousands of others who came over on the boats with them were given a golden opportunity. And so were their children and grandchildren, because the lessons those garment workers brought home with them in the evenings turned out to be critical for getting ahead in the world. 10. The day after Louis and Regina Borjanic sold out their first lot of 40 aprons, Louis made his way to H.B. Claflin and Company. Claflin was a dry goods commission house, the equivalent of Brandstadter's back in Poland. There, Borjanic asked for a salesman who spoke German, since his English was almost non-existent. He had in his hand his and Regina's life savings, $12, and with that money, he bought enough cloth to make 10 dozen aprons. Day and night, he and Regina cut and sewed. He sold all 10 dozen in 2 days. Back he went to Claflin for another round. They sold those too. Before long, he and Regina hired another immigrant just off the boat to help with the children so Regina could sew full-time, and then another to serve as an apprentice. Louis ventured uptown as far as Harlem, selling to the mothers in the tenements. He rented a storefront on Sheriff Street, with living quarters in the back. He hired 3 more girls, and bought sewing machines for all of them. He became known as the Apron Man. He and Regina were selling aprons as fast as they could make them. Before long, the Borjanics decided to branch out. They started making adult aprons, then petticoats, then women's dresses. By January of 1892, the Borjanics had 20 people working for them, mostly immigrant Jews like themselves. They had their own factory on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and a growing list of customers, including a store uptown owned by another Jewish immigrant family, the Bloomingdale brothers. Keep in mind the Borjanics had been in the country for only 3 years at this point. They barely spoke English. And they weren't rich yet by any stretch of the imagination. Whatever profit they made got plowed back into their business, and Borjanic says he had only $200 in the bank. But already he was in charge of his own destiny. This was the second great advantage of the garment industry. It wasn't just that it was growing by leaps and bounds. It was also explicitly entrepreneurial. Clothes weren't made in a single big factory. Instead, a number of established firms designed patterns and prepared the fabric, and then the complicated stitching and pressing and button attaching were all sent out to small contractors. And if a contractor got big enough or ambitious enough, he started designing his own patterns and preparing his own fabric. By 1913, there were approximately 16,000 separate companies in New York City's garment business, many just like the Borjanich's shop on Sheriff Street. The threshold for getting involved in the business was very low. It's basically a business built on the sewing machine, and sewing machines don't cost that much, says Daniel Sawyer, a historian who has written widely on the garment industry. So you didn't need a lot of capital. At the turn of the 20th century, it was probably $50 to buy a machine or two. All you had to do to be a contractor was to have a couple sewing machines, some irons, and a couple of workers. The profit margins were very low, but you could make some money. Listen to how Borjanich describes his decision to expand beyond aprons. From my study of the market, I knew that only 3 men were making children's dresses in 1890. One was an East Side tailor near me, who made only to order, while the other 2 turned out an expensive product with which I had no desire at all to compete. I wanted to make popular price stuff, wash dresses, silks, and woolens. It was my goal to produce dresses that the great mass of the people could afford, dresses that would, from the business angle, sell equally well to both large and small, city and country stores. With Regina's help, she always had excellent taste and judgment. I made up a line of samples. Displaying them to all my old customers and friends, I hammered home every point. My dresses would save mothers endless work, the materials and sewing were as good and probably better than anything that could be done at home, the price was right for quick disposal. On one occasion, Borjanich realized that his only chance to undercut bigger firms was to convince the wholesalers to sell cloth to him directly, eliminating the middleman. He went to see a Mr. Bingham at Lawrence and Company, a tall, gaunt, white-bearded Yankee with steel blue eyes. There the 2 of them were, the immigrant from rural Poland, his eyes ringed with fatigue, facing off in his halting English against the imperious Yankee. Borjanich said he wanted to buy 40 cases of cashmere. Bingham had never before sold to an individual company, let alone a shoestring operation on Sheriff Street. "You have a hell of a cheek coming in here and asking me for favors," Bingham thundered. But he ended up saying yes. What Borjanich was getting in his 18-hour days was a lesson in the modern economy. He was learning market research. He was learning manufacturing. He was learning how to negotiate with imperious Yankees. He was learning how to plug himself into popular culture in order to understand new fashion trends. The Irish and Italian immigrants who came to New York in the same period didn't have that advantage. They didn't have a skill specific to the urban economy. They went to work as day laborers and domestics and construction workers, jobs where you could show up for work every day for 30 years and never learn market research and manufacturing and how to navigate the popular culture and how to negotiate with the Yankees, who ran the world. Or consider the fate of the Mexicans who immigrated to California between 1900 and the end of the 1920s to work in the fields of the big fruit and vegetable growers. They simply exchanged the life of a feudal peasant in Mexico for the life of a feudal peasant in California. The conditions in the garment industry were every bit as bad, Sawyer goes on. But as a garment worker, you were closer to the center of the industry. If you are working in a field in California, you have no clue what's happening to the produce when it gets on the truck. If you are working in a small garment shop, your wages are low, and your conditions are terrible, and your hours are long, but you can see exactly what the successful people are doing, and you can see how you can set up your own job. When Borjanich came home at night to his children, he may have been tired and poor and overwhelmed, but he was alive. He was his own boss. He was responsible for his own decisions and direction. His work was complex, it engaged his mind and imagination. And in his work, there was a relationship between effort and reward. The longer he and Regina stayed up at night sewing aprons, the more money they made. Those three things, autonomy, complexity, and a connection between effort and reward, are, most people agree, the three qualities that work has to have if it is to be satisfying. It is not how much money we make that ultimately makes us happy between 9 and 5. It's whether our work fulfills us. If I offered you a choice between being an architect for $75,000 a year and working in a toll booth every day for the rest of your life for $100,000 a year, which would you take? I'm guessing the former, because there is complexity, autonomy, and a relationship between effort and reward in doing creative work, and that's worth more to most of us than money. Work that fulfills those three criteria is meaningful. Being a teacher is meaningful. Being a physician is meaningful. So is being an entrepreneur, and the miracle of the garment industry, as cutthroat and grim as it was that it allowed people like the Borjanics, just off the boat, to find something meaningful to do as well. When Louis Borjanic came home after first seeing that child's apron, he danced a jig. He hadn't sold anything yet. He was still penniless and desperate, and he knew that to make something of his idea was going to require years of backbreaking labor. But he was ecstatic, because the prospect of those endless years of hard labor did not seem like a burden to him. Bill Gates had that same feeling when he first sat down at the keyboard at Lakeside. And the Beatles didn't recoil in horror when they were told they had to play 8 hours a night, 7 days a week. They jumped at the chance. Hard work is a prison sentence only if it does not have meaning. Once it does, it becomes the kind of thing that makes you grab your wife around the waist and dance a jig. The most important consequence of the miracle of the garment industry, though, was what happened to the children growing up in those homes where meaningful work was practiced. Imagine what it must have been like to watch the meteoric rise of Regina and Louis Borjanic through the eyes of one of their offspring. They learned the same lesson that little Alex Williams would learn nearly a century later, a lesson crucial to those who wanted to tackle the upper reaches of a profession like law or medicine: if you work hard enough and assert yourself and use your mind and imagination, you can shape the world to your desires. 11. In 1982, a sociology graduate student named Louise Farkas went to visit a number of nursing homes and residential hotels in New York City and Miami Beach. She was looking for people like the Borjanics, or, more precisely, the children of people like the Borjanics, who had come to New York in the great wave of Jewish immigration at the turn of the last century. And for each of the people she interviewed, she constructed a family tree showing what a line of parents and children and grandchildren and, in some cases, great-grandchildren did for a living. Here is her account of subject number 18. A Russian tailor artisan comes to America, takes to the needle trade, works in a sweatshop for a small salary. Later takes garments to finish at home with the help of his wife and older children. In order to increase his salary, he works through the night. Later he makes a garment and sells it on New York streets. He accumulates some capital and goes into a business venture with his sons. They open a shop to create men's garments. The Russian tailor and his sons become men's suit manufacturers, supplying several men's stores. The sons and the father become prosperous. The sons' children become educated professionals. Here's another. It's a tanner who emigrated from Poland in the late 19th century. Farkas's Jewish family trees go on for pages, each virtually identical to the one before, until the conclusion becomes inescapable: Jewish doctors and lawyers did not become professionals in spite of their humble origins. They became professionals because of their humble origins. Ted Friedman, the prominent litigator in the 1970s and 1980s, remembers as a child going to concerts with his mother at Carnegie Hall. They were poor and living in the farthest corners of the Bronx. How did they afford tickets? Mary got a quarter, Friedman says. There was a Mary who was a ticket taker, and if you gave Mary a quarter, she would let you stand in the second balcony, without a ticket. Carnegie Hall didn't know about it. It was just between you and Mary. It was a bit of a journey, but we would go back once or twice a month. Friedman's mother was a Russian immigrant. She barely spoke English. But she had gone to work as a seamstress at the age of 15 and had become a prominent garment union organizer, and what you learn in that world is that through your own powers of persuasion and initiative, you can take your kids to Carnegie Hall. There is no better lesson for a budding lawyer than that. The garment industry was boot camp for the professions. What did Joe Flom's father do? He sewed shoulder pads for women's dresses. What did Robert Oppenheimer's father do? He was a garment manufacturer, like Louis Bourgeois. One flight up from Flom's corner office at Skadden, ARP's is the office of Barry Garfinkel, who has been at Skadden, ARP's nearly as long as Flom and who for many years headed the firm's litigation department. What did Garfinkel's mother do? She was a milliner. She made hats at home. What did two of Louis and Regina Bourgeois' sons do? They went to law school, and no less than 9 of their grandchildren ended up as doctors and lawyers as well. Here is the most remarkable of Farkas's family trees. It belongs to a Jewish family from Romania who had a small grocery store in the old country and then came to New York and opened another, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It is the most elegant answer to the question of where all the Joe Floms came from. 12. 10 blocks north of the Skadden, ARP's headquarters in Midtown Manhattan are the offices of Joe Flom's great rival, the law firm generally regarded as the finest in the world. It is headquartered in the prestigious office building known as Black Rock. To get hired there takes a small miracle. Unlike New York's other major law firms, all of which have hundreds of attorneys scattered around the major capitals of the world, it operates only out of that single Manhattan building. It turns down much more business than it accepts. Unlike every one of its competitors, it does not bill by the hour. It simply names a fee. Once, while defending Kmart against a takeover, the firm billed $20 million for 2 weeks' work. Kmart paid, happily. If its attorneys do not outsmart you, they will outwork you, and if they can't outwork you, they'll win through sheer intimidation. There is no firm in the world that has made more money, lawyer for lawyer, over the past 2 decades. On Joe Flom's wall, next to pictures of Flom with George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton, there is a picture of him with the rival firm's managing partner. No one rises to the top of the New York legal profession unless he or she is smart and ambitious and hardworking, and clearly the 4 men who founded the BlackRock firm fit that description. But we know far more than that, don't we? Success is not a random act. It arises out of a predictable and powerful set of circumstances and opportunities, and at this point, after examining the lives of Bill Joy and Bill Gates, pro hockey players and geniuses, and Joe Flom, the Janklows, and the Bourgeois, it shouldn't be hard to figure out where the perfect lawyer comes from. This person will have been born in a demographic trough, so as to have had the best of New York's public schools and the easiest time in the job market. He will be Jewish, of course, and so, locked out of the old-line downtown law firms on account of his antecedents. This person's parents will have done meaningful work in the garment business, passing on to their children autonomy and complexity and the connection between effort and reward. A good school, although it doesn't have to be a great school, will have been attended. He need not have been the smartest in the class, only smart enough. In fact, we can be even more precise. Just as there is a perfect birth date for a 19th-century business tycoon, and a perfect birth date for a software tycoon, there is a perfect birth date for a New York Jewish lawyer as well. It's 1930, because that would give the lawyer the benefit of a blessedly small generation. It would also make him 40 years of age in 1970, when the revolution in the legal world first began, which translates to a healthy 15-year Hamburg period in the takeover business while the white shoe lawyers lingered, oblivious, over their 2 martini lunches. If you want to be a great New York lawyer, it is an advantage to be an outsider, and it is an advantage to have parents who did meaningful work, and, better still, it is an advantage to have been born in the early 1930s. But if you have all 3 advantages, on top of a good dose of ingenuity and drive, then that's an unstoppable combination. That's like being a hockey player born on January 1st. The BlackRock law firm is Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz. The firm's first partner was Herbert Wachtell. He was born in 1931. He grew up in the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union housing across from Van Cortlandt Park, in the Bronx. His parents were Jewish immigrants from the Ukraine. His father was in the ladies' undergarment business with his brothers, on the 6th floor of what is now a fancy loft at Broadway and Spring Street in Soho. He went to New York City public schools in the 1940s, then to New York University, and then to New York University Law School. The second partner was Martin Lipton. He was born in 1931. His father was a manager at a factory. He was a descendant of Jewish immigrants. He attended public schools in Jersey City, then the University of Pennsylvania, then New York University Law School. The third partner was Leonard Rosen. He was born in 1930. He grew up poor in the Bronx, near Yankee Stadium. His parents were Jewish immigrants from the Ukraine. His father worked in the garment district in Manhattan as a presser. He went to New York City public schools in the 1940s, then to City College in Upper Manhattan, and then to New York University Law School. The fourth partner was George Katz. He was born in 1931. He grew up in a one-bedroom first-floor apartment in the Bronx. His parents were the children of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. His father sold insurance. His grandfather, who lived a few blocks away, was a sewer in the garment trade, doing piecework out of his house. He went to New York City public schools in the 1940s, then to City College in Upper Manhattan, and then to New York University Law School. Imagine that we had met any one of these four fresh out of law school, sitting in the elegant waiting room at Mudge Rose next to a blue-eyed Nordic type from the right background. We'd all have bet on the Nordic type. And we would have been wrong. Because the Katzes and the Rosens and the Liptons and the Wachtels and the Floms had something that the Nordic type did not. Their world, their culture and generation and family history, gave them the greatest of opportunities. Part 2 Legacy. Chapter 6. Harlan, Kentucky. Die like a man, like your brother did. 1. In the southeastern corner of Kentucky, in the stretch of the Appalachian Mountains known as the Cumberland Plateau, lies a small town called Harlan. The Cumberland Plateau is a wild and mountainous region of flat-topped ridges, mountain walls 500 to 1,000 feet high, and narrow valleys, some wide enough only for a one-lane road and a creek. When the area was first settled, the plateau was covered with a dense primeval forest. Giant tulip poplars grew in the coves and at the foot of the hills, some with trunks as wide as 7 or 8 feet in diameter. Alongside them were white oaks, beeches, maples, walnuts, sycamores, birches, willows, cedars, pines, and hemlocks, all enmeshed in a lattice of wild grapevine, comprising one of the greatest assortment of forest trees in the northern hemisphere. On the ground were bears and mountain lions and rattlesnakes, in the treetops, an astonishing array of squirrels, and beneath the soil, one thick seam after another of coal. Harlan County was founded in 1819 by 8 immigrant families from the northern regions of the British Isles. They had come to Virginia in the 18th century and then moved west into the Appalachians in search of land. The county was never wealthy. For its first 100 years, it was thinly populated, rarely numbering more than 10,000 people. The first settlers kept pigs and herded sheep on the hillsides, scratching out a living on small farms in the valleys. They made whiskey in backyard stills and felled trees, floating them down the Cumberland River in the spring, when the water was high. Until well into the 20th century, getting to the nearest train station was a 2-day wagon trip. The only way out of town was up Pine Mountain, which was 9 steep miles on a road that turned on occasion into no more than a muddy, rocky trail. Harlan was a remote and strange place, unknown by the larger society around it, and it might well have remained so but for the fact that 2 of the town's founding families, the Howards and the Turners, did not get along. The patriarch of the Howard clan was Samuel Howard. He built the town courthouse and the jail. His counterpart was William Turner, who owned a tavern and 2 general stores. Once a storm blew down the fence to the Turner property, and a neighbor's cow wandered onto their land. William Turner's grandson, Devil Jim, shot the cow dead. The neighbor was too terrified to press charges and fled the county. Another time, a man tried to open a competitor to the Turners' general store. The Turners had a word with him. He closed the store and moved to Indiana. These were not pleasant people. One night Wicks Howard and Little Bob Turner, the grandsons of Samuel and William, respectively, played against each other in a game of poker. Each accused the other of cheating. They fought. The following day they met in the street, and after a flurry of gunshots, little Bob Turner lay dead with a shotgun blast to the chest. A group of Turners went to the Howard's general store and spoke roughly to Mrs. Howard. She was insulted and told her son Wills Howard, and the following week he exchanged gunfire with another of Turner's grandsons, young Will Turner, on the road to Hagen, Virginia. That night one of the Turners and a friend attacked the Howard home. The two families then clashed outside the Harlan courthouse. In the gunfire, Will Turner was shot and killed. A contingent of Howards then went to see Mrs. Turner. Things quickly went from bad to worse. Wills Howard ran into little George Turner near Sulphur Springs and shot him dead. The Howards ambushed 3 friends of the Turners, the Cowoods, killing all of them. A posse was sent out in search of the Howards. In the resulting gunfight, 6 more were killed or wounded. Wills Howard heard the Turners were after him, and he and a friend rode into Harlan and attacked the Turner home. Riding back, the Howards were ambushed. In the fighting, another person died. Wills Howard rode to George Turner's house and fired at him but missed and killed another man. A posse surrounded the Howard home. There was another gunfight. More dead. The county was in an uproar. I think you get the picture. There were places in 19th century America where people lived in harmony. Harlan, Kentucky, was not one of them. Stop that. Will Turner's mother snapped at him when he staggered home, howling in pain after being shot in the courthouse gun battle with the Howards. Die like a man, like your brother did. She belonged to a world so well acquainted with fatal gunshots that she had certain expectations about how they ought to be endured. Will shut his mouth, and he died. 2. Suppose you were sent to Harlan in the late 19th century to investigate the causes of the Howard-Turner feud. You lined up every surviving participant and interviewed them as carefully as you could. You subpoenaed documents and took depositions and pored over court records until you had put together a detailed and precise accounting of each stage in the deadly quarrel. How much would you know? The answer is, not much. You'd learn that there were 2 families in Harlan who didn't much like each other, and you'd confirm that Wills Howard, who was responsible for an awful lot of the violence, probably belonged behind bars. What happened in Harlan wouldn't become clear until you looked at the violence from a much broader perspective. The first critical fact about Harlan is that at the same time that the Howards and the Turners were killing one another, there were almost identical clashes in other small towns up and down the Appalachians. In the famous Hatfield-Mccoy feud on the West Virginia, Kentucky border not far from Harlan, several dozen people were killed in a cycle of violence that stretched over 20 years. In the French Eversole feud in Perry County, Kentucky, 12 died, 6 of them killed by Bad Tom Smith. The Martin-Tolliver feud, in Rowan County, Kentucky, in the mid-1880s featured 3 gunfights, 3 ambushes, and 2 house attacks, and ended in a 2-hour gun battle involving 100 armed men. The Baker-Howard feud in Clay County, Kentucky, began in 1806, with an elk hunting party gone bad, and didn't end until the 1930s, when a couple of Howards killed 3 Bakers in an ambush. And these were just the well-known feuds. The Kentucky legislator Harry Caudill once looked in a circuit court clerk's office in one Cumberland Plateau town and found 1,000 murder indictments stretching from the end of the Civil War, in the 1860s, to the beginning of the 20th century, and this for a region that never numbered more than 15,000 people and where many violent acts never even made it to the indictment stage. Caudill writes of a murder trial in Breathitt County, or Bloody Breathitt, as it came to be known, that ended abruptly when the defendant's father, a man of about 50 with huge handlebar whiskers and 2. The feudist rapped the bench and announced, "Court's over and everybody can go. We ain't a-going to have any court here this term, folks." The red-faced judge hastily acquiesced in this extraordinary order and promptly left town. When court convened at the next term, the court and sheriff were bolstered by 60 militiamen, but by then the defendant was not available for trial. He had been slain from ambush. When one family fights with another, it's a feud. When lots of families fight with one another in identical little towns up and down the same mountain range, it's a pattern. What was the cause of the Appalachian pattern? Over the years, many potential explanations have been examined and debated, and the consensus appears to be that that region was plagued by a particularly virulent strain of what sociologists call a culture of honor. Cultures of honor tend to take root in highlands and other marginally fertile areas, such as Sicily or the mountainous Basque regions of Spain. If you live on some rocky mountainside, the explanation goes, you can't farm. You probably raise goats or sheep, and the kind of culture that grows up around being a herdsman is very different from the culture that grows up around growing crops. The survival of a farmer depends on the cooperation of others in the community. But a herdsman is off by himself. Farmers also don't have to worry that their livelihood will be stolen in the night, because crops can't easily be stolen unless, of course, a thief wants to go to the trouble of harvesting an entire field on his own. But a herdsman does have to worry. He's under constant threat of ruin through the loss of his animals. So he has to be aggressive, he has to make it clear, through his words and deeds, that he is not weak. He has to be willing to fight in response to even the slightest challenge to his reputation, and that's what a culture of honor means. It's a world where a man's reputation is at the center of his livelihood and self-worth. The critical moment in the development of the young shepherd's reputation is his first quarrel. The ethnographer J.K. Campbell writes of one herding culture in Greece. Quarrels are necessarily public. They may occur in the coffee shop, the village square, or most frequently on a grazing boundary where a curse or a stone aimed at one of his straying sheep by another shepherd is an insult which inevitably requires a violent response. So why was Appalachia the way it was? It was because of where the original inhabitants of the region came from. The so-called American Backcountry states, from the Pennsylvania border south and west through Virginia and West Virginia, Kentucky and Tennessee, North Carolina and South Carolina, and the northern end of Alabama and Georgia, were settled overwhelmingly by immigrants from one of the world's most ferocious cultures of honor. They were Scotch-Irish, that is, from the lowlands of Scotland, the northern counties of England, and Ulster in Northern Ireland. The borderlands, as this region was known, were remote and lawless territories that had been fought over for hundreds of years. The people of the region were steeped in violence. They were herdsmen, scraping out a living on rocky and infertile land. They were clannish, responding to the harshness and turmoil of their environment by forming tight family bonds and placing loyalty to blood above all else. And when they immigrated to North America, they moved into the American interior, to remote, lawless, rocky, and marginally fertile places like Harlan that allowed them to reproduce in the New World the culture of honor they had created in the Old World. To the first settlers, the American backcountry was a dangerous environment, just as the British borderlands had been, the historian David Hackett Fisher writes in. Much of the southern highlands were debatable lands, in the border sense of a contested territory without established government or the rule of law. The borderers were more at home than others in this anarchic environment, which was well suited to their family system, their warrior ethic, their farming and herding economy, their attitudes toward land and wealth and their ideas of work and power. So well adapted was the border culture to this environment that other ethnic groups tended to copy it. The ethos of the North British borders came to dominate this dark and bloody ground, partly by force of numbers, but mainly because it was a means of survival in a raw and dangerous world. The triumph of a culture of honor helps to explain why the pattern of criminality in the American South has always been so distinctive. Murder rates are higher there than in the rest of the country. But crimes of property and stranger crimes, like muggings, are lower. As the sociologist John Shelton Reed has written, the homicides in which the South seems to specialize are those in which someone is being killed by someone he knows, for reasons both killer and victim understand. Reed adds, the statistics show that the Southerner who can avoid arguments and adultery is as safe as any other American, and probably safer. In the backcountry, violence wasn't for economic gain. It was personal. You fought over your honor. Many years ago, the Southern newspaperman Harding Carter told the story of how as a young man he served on a jury. As Reed describes it, the case before the jury involved an irascible gentleman who lived next door to a filling station. For several months he had been the butt of various jokes played by the attendants and the miscellaneous loafers who hung around the station, despite his warnings and his notorious short temper. One morning, he emptied both barrels of his shotgun at his tormentors, killing one, maiming another permanently, and wounding a third. When the jury was polled by the incredulous judge, Carter was the only juror who recorded his vote as guilty. As one of the others put it, he wouldn't have been much of a man if he hadn't shot them fellows. Only in a culture of honor would it have occurred to the irascible gentleman that shooting someone was an appropriate response to a personal insult. And only in a culture of honor would it have occurred to a jury that murder, under those circumstances, was not a crime. I realize that we are often wary of making these kinds of broad generalizations about different cultural groups, and with good reason. This is the form that racial and ethnic stereotypes take. We want to believe that we are not prisoners of our ethnic histories. But the simple truth is that if you want to understand what happened in those small towns in Kentucky in the 19th century, you have to go back into the past, and not just 1 or 2 generations. You have to go back 2 or 3 or 400 years, to a country on the other side of the ocean, and look closely at what exactly the people in a very specific geographic area of that country did for a living. The culture of honor hypothesis says that it matters where you're from, not just in terms of where you grew up or where your parents grew up, but in terms of where your great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents grew up and even where your great-great-great-grandparents grew up. That is a strange and powerful fact. It's just the beginning, though, because upon closer examination, cultural legacies turn out to 3. In the early 1990s, 2 psychologists at the University of Michigan, Dov Cohen and Richard Nisbet, decided to conduct an experiment on the culture of honor. They knew that what happened in places like Harlan in the 19th century was, in all likelihood, a product of patterns laid down in the English borderlands centuries before. But their interest was in the present day. Was it possible to find remnants of the culture of honor in the modern era? So they decided to gather together a group of young men and insult them. We sat down and tried to figure out what is the insult that would go to the heart of an 18 to 20-year-old's brain, Cohen says. It didn't take too long to come up with asshole. The experiment went like this. The social sciences building at the University of Michigan has a long, narrow hallway in the basement lined with filing cabinets. The young men were called into a classroom, one by one, and asked to fill out a questionnaire. Then they were told to drop off the questionnaire at the end of the hallway and return to the classroom, a simple, seemingly innocent academic exercise. For half the young men, that was it. They were the control group. For the other half, there was a catch. As they walked down the hallway with their questionnaire, a man, a confederate of the experimenters, walked past them and pulled out a drawer in one of the filing cabinets. The already narrow hallway now became even narrower. As the young men tried to squeeze by, the Confederate looked up, annoyed. He slammed the filing cabinet drawer shut, jostled the young men with his shoulder, and, in a low but audible voice, said the trigger word, asshole. Cohen and Nisbet wanted to measure, as precisely as possible, what being called that word meant. They looked at the faces of their subjects and rated how much anger they saw. They shook the young men's hands to see if their grip was firmer than usual. They took saliva samples from the students, both before and after the insult, to see if being called an asshole caused their levels of testosterone and cortisol, the hormones that drive arousal and aggression, to go up. Finally, they asked the students to read the following story and supply a conclusion. It had only been about 20 minutes since they had arrived at the party when Jill pulled Steve aside, obviously bothered about something. "What's wrong?" asked Steve. "It's Larry. I mean, he knows that you and I are engaged, but he's already made 2 passes at me tonight." Jill walked back into the crowd, and Steve decided to keep his eye on Larry. Sure enough, within 5 minutes, Larry was reaching over and trying to kiss Jill. If you've been insulted, are you more likely to imagine Steve doing something violent to Larry? The results were unequivocal. There were clear differences in how the young men responded to being called a bad name. For some, the insult changed their behavior. For some it didn't. The deciding factor in how they reacted wasn't how emotionally secure they were, or whether they were intellectuals or jocks, or whether they were physically imposing or not. What mattered, and I think you can guess where this is headed, was where they were from. Most of the young men from the northern part of the United States treated the incident with amusement. They laughed it off. Their handshakes were unchanged. Their levels of cortisol actually went down, as if they were unconsciously trying to defuse their own anger. Only a few of them had Steve get violent with Larry. But the Southerners? Oh, my! They were angry. Their cortisol